Welcome to Natural Born Talents. I'm going to bring up a subject that many people have asked me about, and it has to do with the quirkier set of auras, the lavender, the crystal, the indigo, and the violet. There are some auras out there that are so different from mainstream society's rules and games that they come across as having a disorder. Now, heads up on this, I am no doctor. This is only from my own experience and personal opinion. There are some very good doctors out there, and there are some that are just flat out egotists and know nothing. Having said that, I'd like to describe to you what I see often in the cases of disorders versus just having a quirky personality or a quirky aura. So here I'm going to give you a scenario I often see in this country that I'm working in right now. The country I'm working in right now has a pretty rigid education system. The expectation of this society for everybody to follow the education system and the society rules exactly the same way leads to all kind of disorders. But having said that, I often see parents pointing out children with quirky behavior patterns that have nothing to do with disorders, but are a natural part of that individual's aura. Sometimes it turns out to be that they do have a disorder plus a quirky aura. Sometimes it's just a disorder. So I'm going to give you a scenario of a case I know very well, where it was a combination of both. And here's how it goes. The country this child lived in has a very lockstep, logical, linear way of teaching. What that means is everybody is required to follow the same step-by-step, logical, linear order to absorb information. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, by the book, as fast as you can. Now, after studying auras for 35 years, that kind of education system only works well, or reasonably well, for about 1/3 of the population. The other 2/3 have to struggle with it. Some do well with the struggle, some do not, case by case. The other ways of learning can be as follows: physical or hands-on. In other words, by doing something, you absorb information. Emotional. In other words, people of this group tend to do well in things like literature, music, and art. Holistic thinkers. There are 2 or 3 auras that have this, that think randomly, not in aura. They absorb information all at the same time. This group tends to get completely frazzled by the current education system in the world we have today. There are others who also learn by intuitive instincts. I've seen this by certain cases where people, instead of absorbing information by reading, they just kind of feel it out and figure it out that way. Let's get into the scenario. The child was born in this lockstep system. He had a father who was very abusive physically. He had a mother who was a binary, analytical, logical, linear thinker. She was constantly probing his mind, trying to analyze how different he was from the rest of the world, trying to figure it out, running rawshod over the psychological needs of the child, abusing the individual mentally. The child is a holistic thinker with a very intense creative imagination. In other words, the child can see patterns in space, the whole pattern and the details of a pattern at the same time. A very complex ability. But nobody outside of his mind can see his gift. So one day he goes to a rather militant-like school where the school is telling him to fall into order all the time. His mind is racing all over his internal television, shutting out all the teachers and peers around him. When scolded, the individual snaps at the teacher with such rage and violence, the whole class goes silent. So the teachers think that there's some disorder with this child. So they send him to doctors for all kinds of tests. The doctors don't find anything unusual except for his explosive behavior, which they attribute to the father's abusive behavior being passed on down to him. The parents had divorced and the father long ago left the family. But because of this internal television and mixed with this rage, this young individual had difficult socializing as well, had a few close friends who understood instinctively that there was nothing wrong, he was just a little bit different, but didn't socialize like the rest of his siblings did. To make a long story shorter, the child eventually gets into martial arts to control the rage within. Successfully does so, realizes that his father had displaced all that rage upon him and he no longer needed it for anything, and became a very, very peaceful individual. Along with yoga, meditation, and martial arts, this individual learned to control the television that was going through his mind. He turned those images into creative pieces of art. So these disciplines of martial arts, yoga, and meditation allowed this individual to focus much more clearly on this individual's goals. Later became very successful. Now, how much of this is a disorder and how much of this is the aura? Certainly we could look at the rage. The rage and violence this individual went through would be classified by anybody a disorder. It's not healthy. But the other problems, like the lack of ability to focus, which would be influenced by the rage, but was more influenced by that internal television going on inside this individual's head, that was very natural to that individual's thinking. That is not something that can be altered so easily. It can be controlled, but it cannot be eliminated. It cannot be replaced by a more logical, linear, analytical thinking, for example. So is that a disorder? In my opinion, no. That's the natural flow of that individual. Sociably, that person likes only a few friends in their lives. They prefer being alone. The reason being is because they like the time to space out and think of all the images that go through their minds in order to create something new. That's a lot more fun for that individual than putting up with a lot of narcissistic needs of people on social media, for example. But that, to some, is what they would see as a social disorder. And in some cases, it actually is. What is called hikikomori in Japanese are those who have given up on the militant style of lockstep education, end up staying home with their parents, playing games and doing hobbies, and not getting out and doing sociable things. But for this individual, that was natural, and is actually the more that individual spent time alone, the better and stronger they became. Whereas other people who have this disorder are actually just succumbing to the pressure of society and the people around them that they give up. They don't want to be around other people because they're too demanding. They don't want to go to school or social events because there's too much narcissism. They don't want to spend time with other people because they can be more productive alone. Now, for some auras, that's actually a very natural thing for them to have. But for others who are naturally sociable to have this behavior would then definitely be defined as a disorder. That seems to be what the problem is. Along with the fact that so many disorders are being created that it's somewhat fashionable to have one disorder or another is also another issue. But in any case, I always recommend that if any individual feels that they do have some sort of disorder, sure, go have it checked out. But also take a second look. Look at all the auras, especially the lavender, the crystal, the indigo, and the violet. Those auras are more likely to display quirky personalities that might be diagnosed as a disorder, but when it's actually their natural flow to their character. If you have children, you should watch them very carefully. Don't always jump to the conclusion that just because they can't follow a lockstep, linear way of education, that they have a disorder. You might want to try looking into alternative ways of teaching your child if they don't do well in school. What emotional issues are they dealing with? Do they have one of these auras? It's often a combination of many things: environment, aura, parental upbringing, society's rules, and so on. I hope this is helpful. And again, I'd like to mention I'm not a doctor. I've just studied this in many years on my own to answer my questions for myself and also for the students around me. Understanding auras allowed me to teach children in a much more fun and effective way. It's more holistic. It covers everybody: the emotional, the intuitive, the physical, the logical linear thinkers as well. So societies that are rigid and education that is also rigid and lockstep, you're going to see disorders because all of the auras do not fit in that kind of limited world. This is, of course, not to deny that disorders don't exist. You can have a perfect society and still have disorders. It's just to suggest to take a closer look at what a disorder is and what someone's natural way of being is, and not confuse the two. I hope this was helpful. I hope to see you again all on the next video. If you have any questions, please leave it in the comment section below. Thanks again for listening.